Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 87 of Axioms on Trial. As always, let me know if you guys can hear me okay in the audience. I'm here on my own for tonight, but I'm going to bring on Professor Edis. We're going to be talking about questions of philosophy, religion, and science, the ways in which religion and science may be in conflict, or ways in which they may be compatible. And he's written a number of books that we'll be going over in part. So just if you guys can hear me okay, let me know. And I won't waste any time. I'm going to bring him right on. Can you guys hear me okay? Here we go. Perfect. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you again so much for coming on tonight. I really
Okay.
appreciate it. So if you could give our audience a little bit of a background about you, what it is that your interests are, and
Okay.
I know you wrote a number of books. Maybe you can talk
Sure.
about that for a bit.
So I teach physics at Truman State University in the middle of nowhere in Missouri, and my interest, particularly for the last 10, 15 years, has shifted more to the history and philosophy of science. I've always been very interested in what I like to call weirdness, the sort of strange claims that come to us from the fringes of science. So if somebody starts talking about creationism or parapsychology or conspiracy theories or anything like that, I'm automatically interested in the sense that I tend to think that uh, even though such ideas go wrong, sometimes so wrong that you have to say that they're crazy, looking at such cases, I think gives us a good idea about the nature of science.
Right.
So it's a good way to probe questions like why the blazes do we trust mainstream science in the first place? And in connection with that, I've also written a good deal on science and religion issues and things like that. Uh, so that's presumably what I'm going to be talking about.
Great. So I guess that's a really good place to start. I guess maybe if you can elaborate on how looking at the fringes helps us understand the value of science, and how do we trust certain kinds of sources over other ones? What is that process like?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's actually complicated in the sense that very often, if you're skeptical about, as I said, creations and parapsychology and so forth, uh, your first inclination might be to approach this with a kind of a checklist of defining features of good science, typical features of fake science, and things like that. A very common, for example, feature that people tend to highlight tends to be falsifiability. And depending on the person, the list can go very long. They will say that science has to be naturalistic. It will tend to pick the more parsimonious explanation, et cetera, so on and so forth. Now, that's not a bad way of getting started in the sense that when you're studying anything for the first time, probably what you're going to do is you're going to sit down and make a list of properties that you think something has. But this is also a very old philosophy of science. I mean, things like falsifiability go back to the 1930s and so forth. And there's no good reason we should still be talking about falsifiability as a defining characteristic of science any more than we should be taking the biology of the 1930s or the physics of the 1930s as the cutting edge of today's science. We've come a long way since then, and philosophers of science are not falsificationists. And as I said, it gets complicated. Just about anything you can point to that, say, a creationist will do, you will find the mainstream scientists doing as well, and vice versa. So I'm a little bit, I want to argue that the checklist approach is a good way to get started, but you don't want to get stuck with that.
Right. Well, so what is one thing that you think has replaced falsifiability?
Well, okay. Now, this is an area, obviously, in which philosophers of science can disagree fairly strongly sometimes. There are philosophers of science who think that the whole project of trying to find criteria separating real science from fake science is a fool's errand. While there are some who think that, well, this is actually something real. I mean, you can look at something like creationism or flat earth belief or something like that, and there are some things about this that you say, A, this is crazy. This is pretending to be science. It's not real. And there are certain things in common that can help us understand these things. But even those philosophers who tend to think that there is something to demarcate between science and fake science will tend to argue that you kind of have to take things on a case-by-case basis. So if you're arguing against creationism, you have to get into the details of the science. You can't avoid that by coming up with a checklist of bad behavior by creationists or logical fallacies and things like that. As I said, it's a good start, but you shouldn't expect that that will take you a very long way. Because very soon you will find out that there are a lot of creationists out there who are, well, they're smart people. They're not idiots. Very often they have confronted your standard objections that comes their way from these checklists already 5 times already. So you need to argue the science at a certain point. There's no avoiding it, I don't think.
And so, just to clarify, your position is that falsifiability is in some ways outdated.
Yes.
So outside of like what you just said, you said going case to case, case by case basis. What are some principles that you think have come out of philosophy of science to replace or have evolved beyond just falsifiability?
Okay, let me use falsifiability as a starting point. Now, one reason that for about a century now, especially a lot of scientists have latched onto falsifiability as one of the central criteria of something being scientific. And one reason this kind of intuitively makes sense is that often when you're confronting somebody who's making claims to a fringe of science, they will tend to make excuses after a certain point. If you confront, say, for example, a young Earth creationist, it won't take you very long until they start saying that, oh, radiometric dating doesn't work, or oh, the Noah's floods reset the clocks. They'll kind of start making excuses. It's almost like they're pulling out these ways, reasons that evidence shouldn't work out of thin air. And so, yes, there is something to this. This is intellectual bad behavior. But it doesn't necessarily mean that things are flat out unfalsifiability. Sure. I mean, for example, coming from the standpoint of mainstream science, I am a physicist. I trust geophysicists. I know something about what they're doing. And when a geophysicist tells me that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, I think that's plausible. I have some understanding of the evidence in favor of this thing. And to the extent that I accept that the Earth seems to be about 4.5 billion years, I'm also saying that the notion that the Earth is just thousands of years is false. It's not falsifiable. And so it's not as simple as saying, okay, creationists get into this loop of making excuses of this intellectual bad behavior, and therefore you can just totally dismiss it by, say, invoking falsifiability.
Sure, that makes sense. I think I get what you're saying. I think I guess I'm trying to figure out because I'm not, although my background is philosophy, it's not so much philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to understand how it is that the philosophy of science has evolved since then to look at other factors now, like putting falsifiability aside. What are some more like new core aspects of science that I think are good?
It depends on what problem you're trying to solve and what you're trying to address.
Sure.
For example, my preference, one thing I particularly like to emphasize is the institutional aspect of science versus fake science, in the sense that we often tend to think of science as an abstract body of ideas. We tend to think of physics as made out of theories and equations and things like that. And when somebody like a creationist disagrees with our description of the universe, we tend to focus on that particular conflict as a prime example of conflict between science and fake science.
Right.
That's all very fine. But I think also we need to shift our attention to a little bit that science also is a fairly complicated and fairly powerful social institution, embodied in things like universities, government labs and corporate labs and everything like that. And also, when you look at creationism, it also has a certain institutional background. Creationism is very highly connected to a conservative, right-wing, populist religious environment.
Right.
And when you look at the institutions of creationism, such as the Institute of Creation Research or the Discovery Institute, if you're more into the intelligent design variety of creationism. So I think what we need to focus more on a little bit is the institutions. What is the difference between, say, a university science department as an institution as compared to, say, the Discovery Institute? And one of the main features, I think, is worth highlighting is that something like the Discovery Institute, the intelligent design people, they're basically an apologetics factory. Right. They're not, they don't convince me when I look at its institutional structure, when I look at the people associated with it, how they behave and everything like that. I'm not at all convinced that they have the kind of structure that allows them to properly learn about the world. Instead, what they do is they generate protective ideas to keep some particularly religious views from the conflicts it has run in with mainstream science. Right. So that apologetic orientation, for me, is very much a red flag. But then again, this is because I'm interested in that particular institutional question. Someone else may have slightly different interests in, say, how you draw the line between creationism and real science, and they may emphasize different things. That's quite normal.
Right. A question from the audience for you. Do universities have the appropriate structure to get at knowledge?
Yes and no. In the sense that when you emphasize institutions, you have to also, of course, understand that these are real world institutions with all of their quirks and failures and ways that are not quite ideal. And in fact, I would argue that in many cases, university science departments are actually do a very decent job. I trust my colleagues, not just in physics, but also in chemistry, biology, and so on and so forth. But also anybody who's in science long enough knows that we are imperfect. We continually complain about institutional structures that are involved with doing science, with the idea that, yeah, we kind of think we should be able to do better. Everybody will have complained about the peer review process at a certain point, even though it's indispensable for actually putting a basic filter on what gets published out there. It has certain flaws. And even if you want to go even further down, there are many people who are in the field of science studies these days, who are historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science, who really do examine the institutions of science in some detail. And what they come up with is not always flattering. And it's also accurate. There are many areas in science, and particularly applied science these days, where we feel a lot of pressure on us to essentially become intellectual property mills. And this type of institutional structure has its own ways of distorting the process of learning about the world.
Right.
So, in fact, that's one of the reasons that I like focusing on institutions, because one of the pitfalls in debating issues like science versus fake science, science and religion, and so forth, is that there's always a tendency to try and pick out an idealized form of what we favor and compare it to the real world flaws of what we're more skeptical about.
Sure.
For example, I'm not religious, and so I have the natural tendency, just like everybody else, when I'm confronting a religious claim that I disagree, I will have a tendency to pick out the crazy stuff that, say, creationists or some religious apologist says in real life, and contrast that with some sort of idealized science, which ends up being some sort of vague, abstract truth. But I mean, you do this enough, you realize that this is really not a good idea. It's not necessarily, it's not the most honest way of doing things. Sure. So I would like to be able to say that science does a better job in describing the world compared to, say, religiously inspired ideologies or random internet conspiracy theorists or something like that. But I want to be able to say this while also being very much aware of all of the institutional flaws and real world difficulties that comes with actually existing institutions.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Couple more questions for you. What would you say to the objection that universities are also engaged in apologetics by trying to maintain a certain narrative about things like evolution?
Again, that's going to have to be a yes and no thing. Now, there is a certain element you might suspect of apologetics that comes out of universities in this way. Very often, in the public debate over something like creation and evolution, we have the habit, especially in media circles, of bringing in talking heads. And often, if it's a science issue, of course, you go and, if you're a journalist, you call up a couple of people who teach science in your local universities, people you have contacts with. And so therefore, very often what you might have, in particularly public debates, is that if you bring up a biologist and who's trying to explain to the public why evolution is correct and why evolution is not, they may end up resorting to a series of talking points. In fact, a very well-worn set of talking points. It's almost sort of a stereotype bit of thing that biologists tend to do when they're doing this public thing. And that, of course, can look very much like apologetics. Because they're not really doing, this is not how evolution is working in their daily life as a scientist when they're actually working in the lab or they're actually trying to do theoretical science explaining things and so forth. So when you actually get into a biological context where you have to say, for example, bring in students, and you need to defend your ideas of evolution works this way, that way, and so forth, it's actually much more complicated and much more interesting. And it gets much more interesting because you also tend to highlight after a certain point, after the student has enough background knowledge, you tend to start highlighting, hey, these are things we don't know. We are really not entirely sure. There's dispute among the experts in the field about, say, the role of neutral drift and so on and so forth. So you end up in the internal debate of science. If it's doing its job correctly, when you start getting into open research questions, things get a lot more interesting, where you start acknowledging your uncertainties. You start acknowledging your lack of knowledge in certain areas. And very often you will take established knowledge of, okay, we know this, but we also know that in the history of science, things have changed. But for now, this seems solid. We'll take this and we'll use this in trying to advance the next step. But then we try and also be open to the possibility that, well, we may have to rewrite textbooks. It's been done before. Sure. So you kind of have to, again, the details are important over here. The main intellectual production of a university science department is not talking heads on the media. While, say, something like the Discovery Institute and the Institute for Creation Research, their main focus is producing talking points. It's the apologetics.
Right. One more other question for you. What about the social sciences? Would you say that they are getting a knowledge?
You're getting the. I tend to answer questions like this as yes and no, and I'll do the same again.
Yeah.
In the sense that, by and large, yes. I have no problem with my colleagues in social science calling themselves scientists. I think there are many areas of social science where you have some good, solid empirical work. There are many areas of social science where I have to rely on it myself. And in a sense that I keep focusing on the characteristics of institutions. And obviously, the people who have the expertise of studying details of institutions and social movements and so on and so forth, these are the social scientists. Right. So I'm obviously, I can't badmouth social scientists.
Sure.
On the other hand, I also have to acknowledge that there are some long-standing and important criticisms of the way social scientists have been going about doing things. And these are criticisms that have been advanced by social scientists themselves. It's not like I'm coming in as a physicist, as an outsider saying, hey, you guys should do things like physics. I would have no place doing this. But there are long-standing criticisms of social science, particularly its habit of getting entangled with ideologies. And yeah, there's a lot of this going on. And it's not just even one ideology. For example, your ideologies that tend to be predominate in a sociology department are probably very much different than those in an economics department. Right. But both of them both produce good, solid work, and on the other hand, continually give rise to questions: how much of this is ideology? Right. And partially, it's because it's unavoidable. You're dealing with social questions, real-world institutions, and often the motivation for doing this research is try to fix a social problem.
And there's always bias.
That naturally ties into ideologies which tend to give you a sort of a grand picture of, hey, let's do this.
Right.
So I'm not certain that this problem will ever go away in the social sciences. We just have to sort of accept that this is part of the picture and live with it accordingly, maybe.
Right, and navigate through that. I was actually going to ask you this myself, but I'll post this. Do you think that the empirical sciences rely upon certain assumptions or presuppositions when investigating empirical phenomena?
Here I'll do another yes and no. In this sense, when you say something like an assumption, I tend to think of this notion of making an assumption as a term of art, which we often use in physics. So very often in physics, we'll say, okay, assume this and see what happens.
Right.
But the way this works, it's not, if we're doing our job right, it's not supposed to be an assumption that preconditions the answers that we can get.
Right, exactly.
In other words, we assume something and we want to subject it to some sort of reality tests. And we want to be able to come back and say, nah, maybe this is not working very well. Maybe that assumption really fails. And by the way, this is another, getting back to the falsifiability issue, this is another one of those features that falsifiability does kind of point to. You do have to do science in such a way as you have to be open to failure, because you want to learn about the world, not, again, produce apologetics. So yeah. There's a difference between an assumption that preconditions everything, such as, I don't know, biblical inerrancy or something like that.
Right.
And saying, okay, we will assume that our current theories work, that general relativity is going to work fine in cosmology, but you also keep in mind that you know that general relativity is not a quantum theory, and that if you push it too hard, it's going to break down.
Right. One talking point that I've dealt with in debating Muslims in specific is this idea that science itself is based on certain axioms that are themselves not scientific or not verifiable to the sciences. That we need to kind of assume these axioms to even do science in the first place. And that's a talking point that I run into over and over again. What are
Okay,
your thoughts about that?
okay. I'm clearly not impressed with such a position. Mind you, this type of approach doesn't come from out of the blue. It has a certain philosophical pedigree. And it's not just Muslims. You will find this in almost all religious traditions.
Sure.
And so often you find that, I mean, if this was a 19th century, you probably would have things phrased in terms of, well, you make the assumption of the uniformity of nature or something like that.
Right.
Sometimes this comes to you in the notion that we make assumptions about, say, induction or this, that, and the other.
Right.
I don't think so. I think that there's something of a confusion here between, again, the results of science and what you might call some sort of presuppositions that condition the whole work. For example, right now, if you were to try and tell me that you're making an assumption of the uniformity of nature in a certain way, I would have a hard time in the 21st century right now to understand what even you're talking about. Because right now in physics, we say that, okay, there are certain things which seem to be pretty universal, some particular laws of nature that seem to be rather universal symmetries of nature as we can see it. But on the other hand, there are a lot of aspects of physics that are not uniform. So how on earth do we even make sense of this notion that we have this presupposition that nature has to be uniform in a way? And again, I think you have to come back to the idea that we don't want to make assumptions that predetermine what answers we can get.
Right.
But on the other hand, very often we find it a very useful tool to sort of make an assumption. Well, you have to do that to explore things.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that, at least in the context of the uniformity question, I don't think we assume uniformity. I think we observe it in certain areas, and we move or we navigate the space accordingly based on what we observe. I don't think we assume it.
I would agree. Yeah.
So I guess this might be a good segue, because I know that you've spoken about some of the anti-science rhetoric, specifically in the context of Islam, and I'm curious to understand, if you can unpack that a little bit more detail, what it is that you've observed, and why you think that is the mindset that we're facing.
Okay. Partially my interest in the Islamic version of anti-science rhetoric and so forth comes from my personal background. I grew up in Turkey. So part of my family is Muslim. And so it's a religious environment actually that I'm more familiar with than, say, for example, the Protestant Christianity that's common in the United States. So I've been particularly interested in the Islamic version of creationism. And again, it's partially because of personal history. We tend to think sometimes that creationism is a particularly North American Protestant thing, with some small echoes in conservative Christian communities all over the world. But actually, some of the strongest creationist movements in the world are Muslim.
Right.
And in terms of a broad-based rejection of evolution in the population, in terms of resistance to evolution, not just in populist religious circles, but also indeed in the intellectual high culture, the Islamic world's version of creationism is actually stronger than the creationist ones I found, particularly in Turkey, where I originally come from. And so you find something like, okay, creationism, if you're in science education like I am in the United States, is a regular nuisance. And it's sort of one of those problems that never quite go away. But in the United States, we've never had to deal with, say, for example, creationism actually appearing in public education. Creationism, even by most mainstream religious intellectuals, you would say, especially the young earth version of creationism, is tend to be seen as a sort of a hick thing.
Right.
Intelligent design maybe has been trying to get a more respectable aura about itself, but even that has not really succeeded that much. So if you compare that to the success of creationism in countries like Turkey, there's quite a contrast in Turkish education. And in Turkey, this has been around for about 35 years right now, particularly in the period of Islamist rule, which has been going on for the last 20 years. You do have creationism in public education. Little creationist paragraphs will appear in biology textbooks in public schools. In the intellectual high culture in Turkey, you will have religious intellectuals lash out regularly against evolution. It's actually much more successful in that sense. And because I tend to be particularly interested in the institutional aspect of these fake scientific positions, I find it particularly fascinating because of the way that Turkish creationism has actually been much more successful in penetrating academic and media institutions in Turkey compared to the United States. So I think we can learn a lot from the contrast and the different levels of success that creation has enjoyed in these different countries.
Right. What do you think are some steps that could be taken to improve this issue? Are there things that you think that can be done, or is this,
I wish I knew. I really don't know. I mean, in the sense that for science education, as I mentioned, creationism has been a nuisance in the United States for many decades, at least since the young Earth creationist revival in the late 50s. And it's been, as I said, at least in the last 35 years, it's been a very important thing in Turkey as well. And of course, mainstream scientific institutions have tried their best to counter this somehow. Nothing that they have done seems to have worked very well. In fact, it seems very much that issues like creationism tend to turn into political issues with all the sort of tribalism and demands for loyalty that that implies. And so probably then, if you want, say, evolution to succeed and creationism to fade more into the background, this has to do more with wider cultural and political issues rather than, say, details of science education.
Right.
Science education alone does not do it.
Right.
And again, we can see this again in our real world examples. Creationism in the last 10 years, maybe in the United States, has been declining a little bit. And this really comes together with the overall secularization of the United States. The United States has finally and slowly started catching up to places like Europe. And really, Christianity in the United States is now not quite in a state of collapse, but a lot of people are seriously worried about it.
And a lot of people are deconstructing from different religious trauma.
But in, say, for example, in the Islamic examples of successful forms of creationism like that in Turkey, it's been not quite the same thing at all. It's in Turkey, there's been a process of desecularization rather than secularization.
Right. A couple more questions from the audience. And I might have a comment about this as well, but I'll give it to you first. What about reality as intelligible as a presupposition? To verify by observation would be to already presuppose it, and to disprove it would itself be nothing more than to make use of it.
Reality is intelligible. Again, I think this is, obviously, if you don't think reality is intelligible at all, you're not going to do science. But I don't want to confuse a statement of motivation and perhaps an initial assumption that you make with something about reality being intelligible. And also, I want to be a little bit careful about what we mean by intelligible over there. For example, in the history of physics, we have an interesting example that might be relevant. in the early 20th century, we discovered that fundamentally we had to do quantum mechanics, that classical physics broke down. And one of the conceptual issues that the community of physicists really had a very hard time to come to grips with is the fundamental randomness involved with quantum mechanics. I mean, nowadays it's routine. Today's generation of physicists are far removed from those early conceptual and philosophical debates about the nature of randomness in quantum mechanics. We just take it for granted. But the generation of physicists that invented quantum mechanics were having very serious problems about what the blazes is going on over here. Many people were calling physics at the very fundamental, very small level where you have to do quantum mechanics unintelligible, irrational, and things like that. So if, say, for example, your idea of unintelligibility includes fundamental randomness, where no matter what resources you can devote to a task, you cannot, as far as we can see, improve your predictive success, then you might say that, okay, this is where we hit a wall. But that too, some areas of nature are, we can nicely understand what's going on and fit a pattern, attach an equation to it, or at least a graph and a description, and we do fine. But modern science has been around for a couple of centuries right now, and we have plenty of examples where we have stuff that becomes very, very difficult, and indeed you run into situations where you just confront pure randomness. So what does that do with the notion that there's a presupposition that reality is intelligible? Is quantum mechanics really intelligible? I don't know. It depends on what you mean by intelligible.
I also want to add, on top of what you just said, is that the question itself, I think, assumes a certain level of intelligibility to even make sense of the words that you're using. And again, I think language is secondary to phenomena. I don't think these things are presupposed. I think we arrive at some of these observations through our primary experience, and then perhaps try to construct some kind of more generalized understanding of what is going on. But if you didn't think that reality was intelligible, how could you even ask the question? Like, what meaning would the words themselves have? You wouldn't be referring to anything. And another thing, aren't there versions of quantum theory that do not have randomness at their heart? Isn't Bohm's version like that?
Don't confuse the issue of randomness with concepts of metaphysical determinism or not. That's an entirely different issue. I mean randomness in the sense of patternlessness. If you want to be technical, your basic Kolmogorov randomness. It's just a lack of pattern in the data. Bohmian quantum mechanics doesn't make any difference for that.
Right. Okay. Shifting gears slightly, I know you mentioned earlier that you wrote a book about weirdness, right? And
well, that's the title anyway.
And one of the things that you discuss in the book is kind of the spread of conspiracy theories. And I'm curious to understand more what you think about the reason and the causes for those kinds of mindsets. I mean, especially even with COVID, right? Like a lot of the conspiracy theories that I'm seeing surrounding COVID have been quite surprising to me, and I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, I can say a few things, but first, a couple of qualifications. I don't write in detail about conspiracy theories in the sense of explaining why these are attractive to people and so forth. Mm-hmm. I'm not a psychologist.
Right.
And there are psychologists and other social scientists who've done very good work on why things like conspiracy theories can be attractive to many people. And I pretty much have to rely on them. Sure. There's always that element of we have to depend on other people's expertise.
Right.
Now, anything I can tell you about the psychological roots of conspiracy theories is going to be based on other people's work. But I'll have to also say that what interests me about conspiracy theories is not so much the psychology underlying this, as sometimes I tend to push back at ideas that seem irrational. And I like to ask the question, is this really irrational? In the sense that sometimes it maybe serves a purpose. Maybe not a purpose of accurately describing the world, but there are many other purposes in life.
Sure.
And so you have to keep in mind that accurate beliefs about the world have a certain cost associated with them. If you really want to understand physics, you're going to have to devote some time and resources to doing this. And that might be worth it or not, depending on your purposes. Moreover, there's also interesting things where holding some beliefs and expressing those beliefs can have costs associated with possessing those beliefs. And these are very often beliefs that are associated with religion, nationalism, situations where you have to signal loyalty to a particular tribe you are materially dependent on. And there's an important element of this going on in some of the conspiracy theories we are seeing as well. Sometimes talking about conspiracy can be a way of expressing distrust in, say, for example, a particular ruling elite. It can be a way of signaling, hey, I belong to this particular tribe of maybe conservative Christians who do not trust the scientific establishment and things like that. So when we're talking about even rather crazy conspiracy theories, we also have to keep in mind that it's not just the accuracy of the belief that matters. In the overall social and institutional context of where a conspiracy theorist is coming from, it may also even be instrumentally rational in some cases for them to signal that belief and to signal their loyalty by genuinely holding that belief. So it's a lot more complicated than just saying, okay, this is wrong and people must have some sort of psychological defect. In fact, what I like to argue is that sometimes people hold weird beliefs, not because of irrationality, so forth, but because of very normal human psychology.
But I guess I guess I will push back a little bit just on that point, because I mean I can understand the psychological aspects as to why people hold down to certain ideas and certain identities in certain communities. But when I think of the concept of rationality, it seems to me that is, you are rational if your beliefs are in correspondence to what you can verify in the world and how those things can correspond to a reality that we can observe. I'm not sure how those kinds of conspiracy theories or those kinds of identities can themselves be analyzed as rational. Well, I understand the reason why people want to belong, right? Like I understand what drives people to that, but I don't know if that would be necessarily rational.
Okay, well, let me put it this way: there is actually quite a literature on what rationality is supposed to mean, and it's not a clear-cut, univocal concept that we are talking about. And yes, your kind of notion of rationality is particularly common in academic circles.
Right.
I like to call it something like gold-plated rationality. It's a sort of a fully reflective form of rationality where not only do we want to have accurate beliefs, we want to actually reflect properly on our acquisition process of the beliefs and be able to withstand criticism.
Right.
And that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing in an academic environment. But also you have to recognize that that type of rationality is very labor-intensive and costly in certain ways. And academic purposes are a fairly narrow range of purposes in life, which not everybody necessarily shares. There are also much less thick forms of rationality. For example, forms of instrumental rationality that you often use, say, for example, in economic contexts, where you assume far less about the reflectiveness of beliefs. It's mainly a very much sort of surface level pragmatism. Does this serve your purpose? And once you bring in these different varieties of rationality, which may have different associated purposes and costs in the context of different forms of life, it becomes a lot more difficult to just say, call something irrational and walk away. It may be irrational in certain respects. Maybe according to the fully reflective rationality we tend to have as an ideal in academic circles, yes. But maybe it also does a job for them in the context of their way of life.
Right.
So over the years, I've become, you might say, more and more cautious about applying this label irrationality to things.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I guess to some degree, how do I say this? Probably because of my background in philosophy.
Sure.
There are certain common social needs that individuals tend to want to naturally seek that I probably don't value in the same way.
Yeah.
Or that I think may actually be detrimental to one's own well-being ultimately. But I get where you're coming from with what you were describing there. I guess I'm trying to think. Let me see if there's any questions. One thing I wanted to ask you, and I know this is kind of a general question, but I know you had mentioned earlier how there are ways in which you see religion and science in opposition, and there are ways in which you think that they're in perhaps in some kind of harmony. Could you give details as to what you mean by this?
Yeah, because the whole thing really is in the details. You kind of have to make distinctions about what you're talking about when you slap the label science on something and when you slap the label religion on something.
Sure.
So I think there is a fairly serious conflict between science and the supernatural beliefs that tend to be associated with world religions. So if say somebody comes from a religious point of view and tries to argue that karma is real, or if they're trying to argue that there's life after death and that the world is some kind of divine design and things like that, these type of explanations that are based on supernatural agency and so forth, they don't work. Not very well. And the reasons for this are almost entirely what we've learned in science over the last couple of 100 years. So at that level, at the level of the content of science and the supernatural beliefs of some major religions, yeah, I don't think there's any escaping the conflict over there.
Right.
Okay, but there too things can get complicated in the sense that you also have to realize that these supernatural beliefs are not necessarily always the first focus of religious people. There's a lot more religious literature out there on, say, moral behavior and so forth than, say, defending notions of miracles and so forth. Yes, they're all tied together, but very often you find that a religious person cares a lot more about things that we would not necessarily consider fact claims that are amenable to scientific criticism. Okay, then step back another level. There's sometimes the claim that science relies on, say, something like a scientific method, while religious ways of knowing depends on things like leaps of faith. And again, there is something to this. So somebody who says this is not talking out of their hat. But I do think it's more complicated than that. In the sense that the kind of discussion that you need to do to address whether these alleged other ways of knowing are doing the job or not, yes, that's going to involve a fair bit of science and philosophy, the best of our modern knowledge. But it's not going to be something that you're going to resolve in a 5-minute debate. It gets complicated. And if you move even further, if you then start thinking about science and religion more as institutions rather than these abstract bodies of thought, then it becomes even more complicated still. In the sense that, for example, you have to acknowledge that historians of science today really have no use for a conflict narrative as the main thread in the history of science and religion relationships. So basically what happens is that you have to see that science and religion are both fairly complicated and powerful social institutions. And these institutions sometimes will conflict. There have been times in history where science has claimed certain areas for itself and religion has had a hard time letting go. But often there's a sort of a negotiation process where science and religion as institutions negotiate a kind of peace. And that type of compatibility, that type of harmony is just as real as the intellectual conflict between supernatural beliefs and the much more materialist view that modern science has produced of the world.
Right.
So again, this is one of my yes and no answers, but it's a
Sure.
way of saying that, yeah, things are complicated.
Question from the audience. What about this recent trend of people, flat earthers, religious, only accepting science that they can see? Is this inevitable as science builds on an almost infinite layer of knowledge?
Is this inevitable? I'm not sure. That's a hard question to answer. Maybe I'll start by observing that this is not entirely new, and I've ran into it in some interesting circles as well. For example, I once knew a biologist who actually was a young Earth creationist. And this is your PhD biologist. He was quite good in the cell biology lab. But his conception of science was very anti-theoretical. So he had a kind of a philosophy of science that demanded that the real stuff in science was what he could see in his lab. But all that evolution and everything like that, that was just sort of a theory and extrapolation, and it was much more nebulous to him compared to the concrete stuff that he did very well, actually, in his lab. So this type of sometimes anti-theoretical attitude, yes, it does surface regularly, particularly in situations where you have a religious belief to defend against evidence or against the sort of conceptual frameworks that now frame our scientific understanding today.
Right.
Now, why that has become more popular among people like flat earthers, I don't know. I don't even want to speculate because flat earthers are actually a group of people I haven't really studied in any detail. My acquaintance with them has largely been, oh, really? And then move on. So
I got blinded for a second. Another question. What about anchoring God at the end of the cause and effect chain? What's wrong with that? And I think that goes along with the Kalam argument.
I mean, if you want to try it as an explanation, go ahead. I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that. Very often people have claimed that somehow minds and personalities are kind of irreducible, that they certainly cannot be reduced to material goings on, and therefore personal explanations of that sort are an entirely independent form of explanation that are appropriate in some circumstances. And it's appropriate in some circumstances to explaining certain human acts, and by analogy, the sort of personal agents, personal supernatural agents that come in religion are supposed to behave like humans in that way. So if you think this sort of explanation works, yeah, go for it. But the thing is, that type of explanation proposal may succeed or also may not succeed. The way I see it is there's nothing intrinsically wrong with proposing that some sort of supernatural agent is at the bottom of everything. But at the end of the day, what are you really explaining? What does it actually contribute to our understanding of what's going on? And my impression from my experience is this inevitably leads to either blatant falsehoods or a lot of empty talk. Right. You end up with a rather hollowed out explanation that really doesn't do anything. But that doesn't, of course, mean that there's something fundamentally wrong with it as an explanation proposal. Yeah, try it out, see if it works. But it might not work.
Yeah, we have a number of videos on my channel where we address the kalam in detail and go over why I think in some ways it's actually based on certain fallacies, as well as not being scientifically accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one other question I wanted to post here, and just to give a little bit of background, the person asking this is a Christian who believes in intelligent design.
Sure.
There are relatively tight nucleosynthesis constraints on about 5 combinations of parameters. Small changes in these combinations lead to major changes, and life as we know it would not exist. And I think the concept inherent to the statement is the idea that it's reasonable to believe in God because if the constants were different than what they are, life as we know it wouldn't be there.
Okay, but I mean, again, how does this actually contribute? Say, this comes like a statement of some sort of God did this. Yes, but again, how does it actually contribute to our understanding of, say, your particular biological improbability over there? I mean, what are you actually explaining by doing this? I just don't see it.
Yeah, and it seems to me that those kind of assumptions are creating a false picture of this idea of fine-tuning, where in reality, the room for changing of the variance are far greater than they want to admit. And also that all they're really saying is that if things were different, things would be different.
Yeah.
Who cares?
And also, let's keep in mind that fine-tuning issues are not something that our scientists are unfamiliar with. For example, this semester I'm teaching a cosmology course, and issues having to do with fine-tuning, not knowing what probabilities to put on parameter spaces, really just having way too free parameters, the sort of uncertainties really are a major theme of the course. So physicists have some acquaintance with these sorts of things. And we don't really resort to saying, hey, magic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate because there's this mentality where people like this will already have decided that God has to be the explanation, that nothing else is going to be rational. And while they're not really actually explaining anything, they're just assuming that a false picture or a picture of reality that we have no reason to believe is actually corresponding to anything. One last question here. Well, two, actually, two. Does there not have to be a first cause?
No. I mean, the straight up answer really has to be no. And again, you don't want to take your everyday intuitive notions of causality,
right,
and directly bring it into doing science, because it will regularly fail you, especially in physics.
Right.
One of the things that, again, I see it in my physics students, that you kind of have to unlearn as you're figuring out what's going on, is this everyday notion of causality. It really doesn't do a lot of good work in fundamental physics. You learn enough physics at a certain point, you start being comfortable with things happening without cause all the time. In fact, you start thinking of causality as we understand it in everyday life as erected on a substrate of fundamentally random quantum events.
We did a show a while back where we discussed the idea that causality seems to be an emergent feature as opposed to a fundamental one.
Well, there too. I mean, you can have a certain amount of debate about that, because there are certain ideas in quantum gravity right now, very speculative, which might introduce some notion of causality at a fundamental level again. But even that is a very different than our everyday notion of causality.
Sure.
It's a sort of a strange physicsy way of causality that's also goes together with quantum randomness. So,
isn't inflation designed to solve a fine-tuning issue in cosmology?
yes, very much so.
How well do you think that succeeds?
Not completely, in the sense that there's often a trade-off that you introduce when you bring in a new theory to introduce certain puzzles. And inflation has been very successful in explaining a number of puzzles in the sort of standard cosmology which people would have been working with 50, 60 years ago.
Right.
And so in that sense, inflation is very compelling because it draws together multiple different lines of evidence, solves different puzzles, and allows you to do some very interesting calculations which you can then compare with astronomical data. On the other hand, inflation also does this at a price, because you do things like you introduce this inflaton field, this particle and field which nobody knows what it is. You basically design this tailor-made to do exactly the sort of exponential expansion of very early universe that you need. And so there is a certain degree of trading one unknown with another,
right,
with some free parameters that you still have there. But that's not a huge issue. That is almost always the case in cutting-edge science. And we will never probably reach a place in science where we will have no free parameters whatsoever. That probably doesn't even make sense at all.
Right. I have a feeling I know what your answer to this question is going to be, but if it's not God, what is your alternative that instantiates and secures the laws of physics that operate in the universe?
Nothing. At some point, explanations come to an end, and I don't feel a need to sort of slap an explanation, a cause, or anything like that on everything. I'm perfectly happy saying this is the level that we know about in our current understanding of the universe. We know a lot of things, but you should also be impressed by the level of uncertainty we have in a lot of things. And I think of science as a way of managing uncertainty as much as figuring out what's going on.
And so to this, but I'm not sure what he's referring to here. He says, what quantum events and what is your evidence? I don't know what you're referring to here.
This is, if you're talking about quantum randomness, this is textbook stuff. It's been known since the early 20th century, in the very early days of quantum mechanics. Your classic textbook example would be, say, something like radioactive decay events, where whether in any given point in time a radioactive unstable nucleus, whether that individual nucleus will decay or not, is unpredictable. All you can do is give a probability distribution. The predictability comes in when you have a large population of these things.
Right. Does quantum physics give us superpositions of different cause and effect relations?
Well, actually, I have a hard time thinking of cause and effect coming into the picture at all when you're doing quantum mechanics. Again, our everyday concept of causality is very much the type of thing that operates with large-scale objects, much slower than the speed of light, on a fairly low gravity Earth type of planet. Right. It's not something that's fundamental to physics. You have functional relationships, but functional relationships are not the same thing as necessarily causal relationships.
I think philosophically that is a factor that I really struggle with wrapping my head around. And I'm trying to kind of work it out in my own head. Because, like you said, I think these intuitions are so strong.
Yeah.
It's sometimes when I'm trying to understand the science behind some of these things, I don't understand what's being said because I think I'm stuck with these kind of preconceived notions that I'm trying to get rid of.
Okay, but I mean, at least you recognize that. I mean, all of us have to bring a lot of preconceived notions to any field of study.
Sure.
And if you're talking about physics, I sometimes like to describe it as learning physics is as much a process of unlearning as learning.
Right.
Because really, our everyday intuitions about causality, how things should behave, materiality, and everything like that are very unsuitable for fundamental physics. You have to do a lot of unlearning to actually figure out what's going on.
I think the problem is that it seems that modern physics is almost so in conflict with our phenomenology.
In some respects.
And I think, I still struggle with that. He clarified his question. He said, in regards to the origin of life, you said that quantum events played a role.
Possibly. I mean, if you're talking about origins of life, I mean, eventually everything's going to be based on quantum mechanics, but I don't think people who do origins of life chemistry need to do a lot of quantum chemistry. I mean,
And I think
it's just more thermodynamics that goes on over there.
And this is more of the intelligent design thing. If you have a panel with 200 regulators, in order to have a functional outcome, you need to move all of them to the right position. What is a better explanation, intelligence or chance did it? We actually had him on the show once, and we try to explain why these analogies are actually problematic, but it doesn't really seem to have stuck.
So do you want me to go there or not?
Yeah, if you could go there.
Okay, I would say your intuition has a lot to do with context, in the sense that if you're talking about a technological context like you have over here, it's fairly obviously intelligence. But I think in that particular inference, what is doing the heavy lifting is not an improbability argument, a sort of rather iffy inverse probability you seem to be doing over there. But I think the heavy lifting is being done by our background knowledge that we do have these intelligent agents, and we do have a rather narrow context in which you have to get things right just one time. But in biology, for example, the context is entirely different. This is where you have a context where something like, well, good old-fashioned variation of selection can actually do the job.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a great answer. He's confusing something mechanistic and artificial with actual biology and what you find in the natural world. It's just they're not the same thing.
Yeah, but I mean that's largely a matter of context. I mean, there's nothing wrong per se with doing mechanistic analogies and trying to see parallels even between engineering and biology.
Sure.
Sometimes you can get somewhere doing that because functionality is important for biological creatures, even if it's a functionality that comes through Darwinian means rather than top-down design. So it's just that you don't want to get carried away with that intuition.
One more question, and then I'll have a couple of my own curiosity. Do you think that math could give way to some more fundamental language that looks very different?
Okay, my most honest answer is I have no idea. Because I really don't even quite know what that means.
Maybe he can elaborate on that. But I want to ask you, just out of my own curiosity, what you think about, because you mentioned this earlier about physicalism and how do I phrase this? Do you think the physicalist view of consciousness, this idea that we can reduce consciousness to a physical description, is a project that was successful or has hopes to still be successful? Or what is your take on that?
I have every sympathy for this as a research project. I think we've learned some things, and one of the things we've learned about is that we are very much at the beginning of this project. So I don't think anybody's entitled to say we see the light at the end of the tunnel or anything right now.
Sure.
My personal connection with the whole physicalist argument is different, not with consciousness. That's not my area of study. But I have done some work on physicalism in the sense of physical explanations as combinations of rules and randomness, and the scope of those, and the reasons we might expect that we should not see any violations in any sort of future physics of any sort of thing like that. But mine is a sort of sideways approach to the whole thing. I don't do cognitive neuroscience or anything like that. I mean, I like it. I read about it, but I'm not by no means any expert.
And one more question for me. I guess, how do I say this? What maybe share with us a little bit your work in physics, and if there's anything that you think that our audience will benefit in knowing about maybe some of what you find interesting nowadays, or work that you've done that you might want to share.
The work that I've done in physics is honestly not very exciting, in the sense of it's not something that you would get people interested who are not really already deeply invested in that particular technical problem. And as I said, for the last maybe 15 years, I haven't been publishing straight physics stuff at all. It's all been in history and philosophy of science. So I've kind of retooled myself.
Are there any books that you want to plug, maybe for the audience?
I mean, if you're interested, I think my last book, Weirdness, what fake science and the paranormal tells us about the nature of science, provided you have a suitably dark sense of humor, you might enjoy it.
Great. I'll definitely take a look at that for sure. So guys, if you have any last questions for our guest, let me know in the audience. I want to respect your time. Usually we go an hour and a half. We've passed the 1 hour mark, but I would love to have you back on sometime if you're interested.
Sure.
I really appreciate this conversation. I think that a lot of interesting ground was covered.
Sure.
If you guys have any questions left, just let me know. I think that I should be back on with another show later in the week. I'm still not home yet, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. But I will let you guys know when I'll be on next. And then I think that, oh, wow. Thank you so much, Bones. I really appreciate that. Any contributions always go a long way. If you guys like our content, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate you guys being here with us tonight. And thank you again, Professor, for having joined us.
Thanks for having me on.
With that, I will say goodbye, and I hope you guys are safe, and I will be back in a couple of days, probably. So I hope you guys have a great night, and thanks again. Thank you.